Hello, everyone. It is that time of the week again. It is Tuesday, March 1st, time for me, your host, Jim Lawrence, M.I.L.F podcast, Me I Like Facts, to bring you a little more information, hopefully something to think about and encourage progress. Yeah, progress in intellectual thinking is what I like to refer to it as. So what do we got going on this week? Lots going on. You know what? We're living in very, very chaotic, unbelievable times to some degree. I mean, I'm a child of the 70s, early 80s. A lot of strife. There was a lot of chaos going on back then when it comes to, uh, the Protestant Catholic wars in Ireland. You had the Vietnam War, the back end of the Vietnam War coming on. All of the protests related to that. You had a lot of economic instability in the early 70s. Gas prices high, gas shortages, inflation in the mid 80s, things like that. So I'm not unfamiliar with these times, but obviously, first pandemic I've been through. The fact that there's a land war going on in Europe doesn't surprise me. It really shouldn't surprise. I mean, it may surprise some pre-millennials, some Zoomers. They've never experienced this in their lifetime before. And they've never lived under a nuclear threat. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we used to do bomb drills back in public school. We used to take training in case back in those days the Russians, the USSR, decided they were going to launch some nukes. Growing up with that as a child, not sure how it impacted me. I really haven't thought about it a whole lot. But here we are again. 50, 60 years later, right back at it. I would suggest, if you really want to get a take on what's going on right now, where we're at, I think we're in the 6th day of the invasion. Ukrainian people have proved to be shown very resourceful, very stoic. A lot of military background for a lot of these people. What a lot of people don't realize about a lot of European countries is that, there is some standardized military service that has to take place. There's a rotation that goes on in Ukraine where, young men for X number of months have to spend time in the military. They rotate out, new ones come in. That's their military service. So, everybody has some basic level of training when it comes to fighting, when it comes to weapon use, things of that nature. Now, you got all the NATO nations, which are still trying to come up with thoughtful sanctions. A lot of the sanctions to date really are not going to make a difference. I mean, two that were really, really touted. One was SWIFT, which is the European transaction system. There's 45 plus other systems the Russians can use, and the Russians have their own. China also has their own. So, that's been ballyhooed. A lot of hyperbole about that. That's really not going to do much at all, especially when they've carved out energy payments, because that's how the Germans and the Italians pay Russia for their oil and gases through the SWIFT system. Negligible effect. Freezing Russian central bank reserve assets around the world will have some effect. The bulk of Russians' monetary reserves were not in those. So it will affect them to some degree. All it would really do is kind of shorten the time frame as to which Putin can continue this invasion. But strategically on the ground, if you really want to get a good take, I suggest you go. I posted this on Facebook. I think it was last night or 2 nights ago. A thread from Twitter from a gentleman by the name of Michael Kaufman, Kofman. Might want to follow him on Twitter. He's director of Russian studies in Washington, D.C. for some think tank. But it was fucking spot on. Two things that Vladimir Putin has miscalculated. One was the resistance of the Ukraine people, which couldn't, end up being bad for them because, he was trying to be a bit surgical about this. He was trying to do this in a way that would cause the least amount of collateral damage. And by doing that, he hasn't moved as far as he would like to have moved. He also overestimated, I guess what I would call the motivation of his own troops. I mean, Slavic people fighting Slavic people, even though there's centuries and centuries of it documented through history, not something that a lot of Slavs want to do today. So, a lot of troops, when they found out that it wasn't exercises, they were actually going in to Ukraine to invade it, I think they were somewhat surprised. So their motivation is pretty low. It'll be interesting to see how Putin deals with that. But ultimately, will Ukraine prevail? No. I mean, if Russia's only sent in about half of their forces. If they really want to get messy about this, they can. The mother of all bombs was reported to have gone off yesterday. I haven't seen a lot of evidence of that. And for those who don't know what the MOABs are basically, high yield incendiary devices that suck all the oxygen out of a certain area and, basically suck oxygen right out of your lungs. So there's the explosive component to it. There's the residual component of alleviating an area of oxygen. It becomes a vacuum. People can't breathe, kills them instantly. And, it'd be a horrible way to die. But what you're going to see is you're going to see much more aggression. You're going to see much more carpet style warfare. You're seeing that already, where they're just going to start bombing. They may target certain things, but Putin ultimately wants to break the will of the Ukrainian people. I'm not sure that's possible, but he's going to cause a lot of carnage doing it. In NATO, you have, Germany finally stepping up to their NATO obligation. They've expressed a desire to want to increase the percentage of their GDP spending on military, which is long overdue. The Germans have been waning on this for years, and they've been relying on the 30,000+ troops that the U.S. has permanently stationed there. Belarus, how do they play in all this? Well, Belarus allowed Russia to use their northern border to invade Ukraine. That was the easiest way to Chernobyl first, Pripyat, and to Kyiv next. Belarus did talk about possibly sending troops. Looks like the premier or prime minister has backed off on that. The world community is talking about holding Belarus accountable for war crimes as well. I think that's probably scared them a little bit. You have talk out of both Switzerland and Finland, which are neutral countries. They aren't in favor of the Russians, but they do not belong to NATO as well. You've heard talk about the Finnish prime minister requesting to go into NATO. I'm not sure whether Switzerland has gone that far yet. I know both those countries have, presented anti-tank weapons, things like M.I.L.Fs, which are basically a device, shoulder-held device, and what it does, you shoot it about a meter above the top of the tank. It senses where it is, it explodes, causes significant damage. It'll take a tank out, no problem. You can go online and see a fair bit of real-time footage, not real-time footage, but actual footage of this happening in Ukraine. Stinger missiles, things of that nature. The Russian Air Force really hasn't been involved in this. Again, Russia's holding back. They're holding back because they don't want to cause the carnage. But by the same token, Putin's not going to relent. So if he figures that he needs to cause a lot of civilian carnage in order to meet his mandate, it's going to happen. Like, don't even question it in your mind. The only other thing I'll say about this, I think that was it, actually. Not the topic for today, surprisingly enough. We're in part 5 of the Bitcoin Standard, the awesome book by Safedin Ammous. So a little bit of recap on part 4. We were talking about the history of gold in the form of coins as currency, starting with Julius Caesar. The 8-ounce gold coin that became very commonly used throughout the Roman Empire. Coin clipping began after, he needed to fund his hedonistic lifestyle that was primarily set up in Rome. And by the same token, he needed to fund more conquests, bring the pagans in line. And he did this all through coin clipping, devalued the currency, increased the level of currency by devaluing the currency. caused over the centuries a lot of people to flee the urban centers, go to the countrysides to establish a simpler way of life, but a more self-reliant way of life, a way of life that wasn't as much controlled by the political forces that were going on in Rome in those days. Kind of sound like modern times, doesn't it? These became the serfs, and this is where the feudal system eventually got set up. But before all that, we're going to talk a little bit more about Rome's play in this. We're going to talk about Constantine, who was the first Christian emperor. Now you have to understand, in Jesus' time, right around, born 3 AD, if you believe in that, died 33 AD under Roman rule. Rome was the largest empire at that time. Once Christ died, or up until that point, and for about 300 years after that, the official Roman religion was a pagan religion. It was a pantheon of gods. That's where Christmas, a celebration of the Saturnalia, comes. A lot of pagan customs or a lot of so-called Christian customs that we have today actually originated or have pagan origins, and Saturnalia is probably one of the more famous ones. 325 CE had what was called the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was basically the adoption of Christianity as the official state religion in Rome. And the only reason that they did that is not because Rome as an entity wanted to be more Christ-like. The reason that they did that is because Christianity was becoming the dominant religion. And government control, doesn't matter what time, what era, it's about two things. It's about manipulation and power. So by making it the official state religion, the government would have an easier time controlling the masses, through this kind of effort. So let's talk about coins. The 8-ounce coin from Caesar's reign had been clipped down to 4.6 ounces. So, as a store of wealth, it had been considerably devalued, which was leading to a lot of economic problems in Rome around that time. Constantine kept the solidus, that's what the coin was called. He kept the solidus at 4.6 ounces. And the Roman Empire at that time moved as far east as Constantinople. I always have a hard time saying this word, which was kind of a gateway to the east. Opened up more trade to the east. It was Constantinople at one time was the trading capital of the world. So the solidus at this point became the longest serving currency in human history. It was renamed the bezant. It was widely used across the Roman Empire, and it held value. Now, when Rome eventually did fall to the Ottomans, Constantinople remained because, again, it was a trade hub. It was a hub of a lot of cultures and regions coming together in order to affect trade. When it was taken over by the Ottomans, they created what was called the dinar. The dinar Ottomans were Islamic, right? They were Muslims. The dinar became their currency. And you can still find dinar today. There are some nations, I'm not sure whether it's still their official currency, but you will find rural settings in the Middle East where that's still used as currency. Okay, so we're talking a long time period. The dinar was the same size and weight of the bezant. So for 17 centuries, this coin under different names has been used. Early on, it was called the solidus, which was created by Rome. It was later changed to the bezant towards the end of the Roman Empire, and then eventually became the dinar. Okay, so let's talk about that step that went from Roman Empire to the Ottomans to what's now known as modern Europe today. This is effectively called the Renaissance. So what happened is in Roman times, you had an exodus out of large urban centers to the countryside, okay? As I mentioned earlier, people didn't want emperors, politicians, senators, affecting their daily lives in such a drastic way. They wanted to take more control back. So what they did is they went back to the countryside. The problem with going to the countryside is, there was drought, there was disease, there was death. This is some of the results of what I refer to as serfdom. Then you had a flourishing again of urban cities, and we're fast forwarding again to the 14th century. One of the first urban cities of the Renaissance was a place called Florence in Italy. They developed a currency called the florin, which became Europeans' prime medium of exchange. And Florence at that time was also the commercial center of Europe. A few years later, you had Venice, another ancient European city that formulated what's called the ducat. And then eventually, over time, you had 150 European cities and states that created their own currency based on the florin. Okay, so this was kind of the breakaway, if you want to call it, of a large, massive area like the Roman Empire that was using the solidus and the bezant for years as a common currency medium of exchange. Now you have individual states and cities, municipalities that are starting to exercise their right to be able to do this. So this is a bit of a precursor to fiat money that we ultimately, most in the world, use today. And what it allowed is it allowed economic liberation of the peasantry. Okay, so there was some benefit to this. Money that was controlled by the state, i.e. Rome, and whatever decisions they made could have a huge impact on people of low income. The creation of currencies relative to their own cities or their own countries had a way of giving the countryside people, the peasants, the serfs, some economic freedom. And it was at this time you had probably the biggest scientific, political, cultural, and intellectual flourishing across Europe. Okay. Doesn't mean that they didn't debase their currency in order to, foment war. I mean, the period I'm talking about, the 14th century, which is, 1300 roughly, right up into our modern time, as we're seeing today between Russia and Ukraine, there's been no lack of wars in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars, the 30-Year War, the German-Prussian War, World War I, World War II. I mean, no lack of wars, okay? And in all the instances that the countries decided to engage in conflict, you would see a debasement of the currency. On a side note, they would use it to prop up their lavish lifestyles as well. I mean, much of Europe up until even the 19th century, or even the 20th century for that matter, had monarchical systems. So these were countries via which, through lineage, it was established that a certain ruler was from a certain bloodline, thereby they had rights to the throne. Okay, which is a fucking stupid way of doing things, because there was no guarantee of their morality, and there was no guarantee of their intellect, and there was no guarantee of their level of service to the public good. In fact, the opposite was quite true. Most monarchs thought that the rabble were there to serve them. You had heavy taxation. Again, you had two classes. You had the feudal system, basically. Okay, so around this time that, again, we're going back a few hundred years, around this time that a lot of these municipalities and countries were creating their own currencies, you still had gold and silver as the primary medium of exchange. Silver began to disappear. It began to move away from coins. Silver had been a reasonable store of value. It wasn't as good as gold because of the ability of gold to not be broken down through its chemical structure. Silver, not so much. Silver would, I mean, if you have anything, your grandparents' parents have silver items in the house, you can see that they can lay for a period of time and they become tarnished. It's a slow process. I mean, it's not like complete oxidization of ferrous-based metals, which is basically rust, but it is a slower process. Silver begins to disappear. There was a few attempts after that to try to bring it back. I think I highlighted one a couple of weeks ago, back in the 80s, where a couple of brothers tried to reinstitute silver as a method of exchange, and ended up taking billions in a bath in what I would call an easy money bubble. Okay, so two inventions primarily sped up this move away from coins. First of all, you had the telegraph in 1837, gave the ability for banks to be able to communicate with each other. Then you had the advent of trains, which meant that people could now start traveling over longer distances and start to spread out into certain areas, and there was more interconnectivity. This led to what's called paper exchange, and that became a form of currency. So here's a scenario. You had somebody who had a bank account at a bank in a major urban center, and in that bank account was a certain amount of gold, okay? What would happen is they wanted to be able to send some money, wire, so to speak, to somebody in another area so that they could take the value of that wire and to be able to go and spend it on themselves or buy something with it. So what would happen is you would have, the bank would telegraph the instructions. I want to not transfer, that's not the right word, because you physically weren't taking the gold out of the person's reserve account and sending it anywhere physically. What you were doing is the bank was saying, this individual wants to send X number of dollars or whatever the fiat money was. They want to send that to somebody else. Now through telegraph, they could actually send the instructions to do that. On the receiving end of the telegraph, they would write this information down as a note, as a receipt. And then what would happen is that person could take that receipt. It was as good as cash or good as gold, and they could take it and they could purchase what they wanted with it. Okay, so this became paper exchange, which again is a precursor to fiat money. So really you have two things kind of coming together here, three things: technology to be able to do it, paper money being a form of currency, and then you had countries that were starting to exercise their control and will over money by creating their own currencies. So paper currency, in effect, became backed by precious metal in vaults. Now, Britain officially adopted the gold standard in 1717. And ironically enough, I never knew this. Everybody knows who Isaac Newton is, I'm sure, you know, the inventor of the theory of relativity and a whole bunch of other physics doctrine. He was actually the warden of the mint, the first mint, when Britain adopted the gold standard in 1717. So he's basically like, you know, the equivalent role today would be the president of a central bank in a country, who's responsible for the reserves and responsible for monetary policy. Now, I'm not sure whether Newton was given the ability to execute monetary policy, but he was in fact in charge of the gold reserves. So after the Napoleonic Wars, more countries adopted gold. So they would transact on gold stores in banks, checks, and things of that nature. So gold became the reserve. It became the store of value as to which you could exercise commerce through paper, whether it was through banknotes, whether it was through receipts, whether it was through checks. Now, silver was gone almost at this point in time. And what's interesting, when you compare gold and silver as stores of value, it's interesting to see how silver has tapered off over the centuries versus gold. So back in around this time, again, we're talking around this the 18th century, Gold versus silver had a 15-to-1 ratio. So for every 15 silver coins equal one gold coin. Over the 20th century, that ratio has gone up 47-to-1. In 2017, which is the last measurement that I had access to, it was 75-to-1. So it again proves out the fact that even though silver did serve as temporary currency, specifically in minute denominations, depending upon the name and the structure of the currencies in all these countries, its ratio, its value has dropped off relative to gold, which is no surprise. Of note was the fact that China and Hong Kong were the last countries in 1935 to actually go over to what I would call the gold standard or the gold reserve. India was one of those countries as well, not quite as long. But I was listening to a podcast a couple of nights ago where the gentleman on there was making the correlation between the fact that India and China, different today, but the fact that they came and used their currencies against the gold standard really hampered their progress. And I'm talking about, around the turn of the 20th century, up in, the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. I mean, these were fucking poor nations. A lot of it had to do with population, but a fair bit of it had to do with the fact that, they were money printing machines afterwards. The value of their currencies had always been relatively low until they started to become more and more industrial giants, increase their output, increase their GDP, till the point we get to today where China has, the largest GDP output of any country in the world. It's even exceeded the US. That could have happened a lot quicker if they had have hedged their currencies against gold as a reserve. They were the two latest largest companies to do that, or countries. And as a result of that, it really impeded their progress for a number of decades. So both China and India were lagged behind, tied to demonetization of silver, foreign ownership heightened as a result of it. And again, that was part of what was going on. When a currency or the value of a currency is low, it generally means the value of the goods and services in that country is low. So what happens is you have a lot of foreign investment coming in. They're looking at it and they're saying, holy shit, this is cheap to buy, or this is cheap to get. So, they're buying labor in the form of industrialization, manufacturing facilities. They're buying property because it's so fucking cheap. So, the lack of identity or the lack of economic progress in a country can really be tied to how devalued their currency is, obviously, as it is relative to a government. Even though currency is devalued and you're an outsider with a lot of money, you don't necessarily want to go in and invest if you're dealing with an unstable regime, again, which we're seeing today in the Ukraine-Russia situation. So now we come to what's called La Belle Epoche. La Belle Epoche was the latter half of the 19th century. So basically, we're talking about the time frame between 1850 and 1900. These were called the good years, or some refer to them as the golden years. At this point in time, everybody was using the same monetary system. It was a different currency, okay, but it was all measured against gold. So effectively, all you had to do is you had to take the English pound as an example. The English pound in England, its currency was valued that 1 pound equaled 7.3 grams of gold. The franc, 1 franc as an example, 0.2 grams of gold. So there was a 36.5 times difference between the unit measure of 1 pound and 1 franc, but it was still a fixed measurement. Everybody knew that the pound was 7.3. Everybody knew that the franc was 0.2. I remember when I first traveled to Europe, this was 1985, and I spent a month in France and Britain. First time I'd gone abroad, I think I was 25 at the time. And one of the things I was really having a hard time getting my head wrapped around was not so much the conversion between the Canadian dollar and the pound. That conversion back then was about $1.60. So for every $1.60 Canadian, you got 1 pound. but it was the francs because it's a higher unit. It's a higher unit measure. So you really had to do your math all the time whenever you were buying anything. Because again, if I looked at something and it was 600 francs in the window, and I'm looking at the item, I'm looking at the value of it or the sticker price, it's not registering with me whether that's a lot or whether that's a little, because I didn't grow up with the franc. It only registered to me that when I converted francs into dollars, I would look at that and I would say, okay, am I going to pay for that meal? What would that cost me in Canada? Okay, well, that's going to cost me like 10 bucks in Canada. It's costing me 12 bucks here in francs. I'm okay with that. I'm on vacation, even though I wasn't. I was on a $25 a day budget. I wonder if anybody can do that anymore. Seriously, 30 days, 31 days, I was on a $25 a day budget, which meant I had to be pretty careful when it came to math calculations when I was converting from the Canadian dollar to the pound or from the Canadian dollar to the franc. Okay, so everybody was using the same monetary system. In effect, they were using the gold as a standard. Okay, the gold reserves, gold bullion, whatever they had in their reserve banks or in the banking system became the hedge against the currency, whatever paper currency that was. So it represented economic value store against store of value. 150 nations went to the gold standard. Other nations used gold coin as currency. And through this time, you have to understand that through 1850 to 1900, we had a lot of 0 to 1s. I think I alluded to this about 3 podcasts ago. And effectively what that meant is this, is that the creations and inventions during that period where everybody's currency was backed by gold, or most people's currency was backed by gold. You had paper currency, again, backed by gold, that was making it very easy to do worldwide trade. And so it was unprecedented what was happening at this time. And as a result of that, and the invention of communication, trains and things of that nature, and eventually what led up to aircraft, later in the early 20th century, we became more of a global economy, I guess is ultimately what I'm trying to say. We could circumnavigate the globe with one currency. So this is referred to as the U.S. Gilded Age. Political and economic freedom. Again, getting back to the 0 to 1, most of the major achievements happened. So I'll give you an example of a 0 to 1. An example of 0 to 1 is a telegraph, okay? Where before you could not communicate across great distances through a medium. The telegraph gave you the ability to communicate through great distances through wires, overhead wires, via this, tapping and coding system. The internet is a direct result of that technology being born. So the 0 to 1 event was from not having something to having something that had been unheard of. And we're still living in that one event. Okay. So we're still at 1, even though people would argue that, the internet has certainly advanced a lot from the telegraph, but it's still a form of long distance communication over a certain medium. In this case, it happens to be wirelessly or wired through the telephone cable systems, Ethernet that are going on everywhere around the world. But the 0 to 1 event happened with the telegraph. There was so many examples of that. There was literally dozens and dozens and dozens of examples. We have not had a time, like as much progress as we've experienced in the last 50 years, we have still not had a time that was even close to the last 50 years of the 19th century. Okay, so this promoted a lot of also Western liberalism, democracy. Okay, a lot of countries loved the concept. A lot of countries loved the idea. This all ended, of course, in 1914, when most countries went off the gold standard. And what they did is, instead of hedging their money against gold, which was a rock solid anchor, so to speak, they started printing money in scarce amounts so that they could finance warfare, in effect, which is what World War I was. So what happened in this particular case, it would lead to a run on gold and paper currency traded for gold. Gold centralized banks and central banks, as we move forward in time, become more government controlled. And here's what happened. When the central banks, the government controlled central banks and the private banks, in effect, what happened is when money printing started to finance whatever nations wanted to finance, and in the case of the early 20th century, it was warfare. What would happen is the private banks followed suit. Now, they don't do this today because there's regulations in place to do this, but they began to create money as well, because it was too tough a pull. And I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a bank manager. I'm a bank manager back in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And I live in a country or a city that has a central bank, okay? So my ability to be able to loan people money out of my bank was dependent upon two things. It was dependent upon the store of gold physically in my bank, but it was also dependent upon the store of gold that I had in the reserve bank, okay? Now, let's say, for example, you didn't have a store of gold in the reserve bank. There was nothing you could fall back on. And you had X ounces of gold in your bank, which by what is supposed to happen is the people that bank there, that have accounts there, are supposed to be able to draw money against their store of gold inside the bank, okay? So that's what I'm referring to, is their gold actually inside the bank. The bank actually doesn't own it, but it's all of their gold inside the bank. But the bank starts becoming a little bit liberal as to what it's actually doing. If it loans money, it makes a percentage back. So it loans X number of dollars over an X time frame at an X rate of return. And then as that person makes those payments over that term, finally at the end of the term, the entire loan's paid back, and the bank has made X number of dollars on loaning that money out. Well, then what they started doing, but they weren't supposed to go above the level of the pooled reserve inside the bank, or the pooled reserve that they own inside the central bank, but they started going outside of that, which is effectively what happened in the 2008 crash, the housing crash and the stock crash. And it's a little more complicated than that at that time, but effectively what the bank started doing is they started loaning more banknotes or more loans or money over and above what they had in reserve. That was called risk, okay? They were okay with doing that. And some of them did it to massive degrees. Now, there's regulations in place that prevent banks from doing that much these days. We still do it. And a good example of that is the central bank. The central bank does that. But typically what they do is they sell bonds, or the government sells bonds. The Reserve Bank buys those bonds at a set rate, and then that's how the government is able to spend more money. But at some time in time, those bonds are going to be sold again, because the Reserve Bank is supposed to get their money back at some point in time. There's short-term bonds, midterm bonds, long-term bonds. They're all set at different rates. Short-term bonds are typically set at lower rates. The longer you go, the higher the rates are, because that allows the government to hang on to that money longer before they actually, those bonds come to term and they actually have to pay them off. So private banks began to create money, in effect. The owner's credit was monetized, and then government gradually took over the banks. Some positive things about that, there was a lot of banks that did this unethically, and they got over leveraged, okay? They were actually, They had loans out to people that would be 5 or 10 times more than what their actual reserves were in the bank to cover that. And if these loans got called, then what would happen is, or if people wanted to pull their deposits out for whatever reason, they wanted to pull their deposits out, and the banks called the loans back, and the people had the loans weren't willing to pay the banks back early, the banks wouldn't in effect have enough store of value in their reserves to pay off the people that wanted to take their deposits out. I mean, you can't walk into a bank. Some banks you can in the world, but there's no way that I could go down to the CIBC down here at the corner and say, I want to close my account down. I need $1 million. They're not going to have that, or they're probably not going to have that in the safe. They're probably going to have to make arrangements to get cash moved from one location to another so that I could fucking walk out of the bank with $1 million in a suitcase. Okay, so over the years, you've had people that have been fighting the gold standard, okay? And around that time, there was, and again, I'm talking about late 19th century, early 20th century. You had people that were fighting the gold standard, okay? And when somebody's fighting something that's conservative and safe, you have to ask them two questions. Okay, well, why are you fighting it? What's your motivations? And what are you going to do when you've achieved those goals? So the three groups that I'm going to refer to here are nationalists, interventionists, and credit expansionists. Okay, because remember, the gold reserve, gold standard, okay, that was a fixed finite amount that a government had. They didn't want banks extending credit beyond what those reserves were, okay, because those reserves were the life preserver. They were the protection. Nationalists wanted that severance made because it would create autocracies in the world government, okay? Nationalists are typically people that want to retract globally, okay? What they want to do is they want to create fundamentally their own system within their own country. Russia is a good example of this. And you can have nationalists in a lot of different countries, but the primary theory of nationalism is, a high bolster of the state and its ideals, and a shrinkage, so to speak. It's a protectionist kind of thing where we're going to make our own decisions relative to our own country and our own ideals. That's what nationalism is. So if you have a currency that's being accepted worldwide, and it's a currency that is being manipulated by decisions that are happening worldwide, as a nationalist, you don't want that. You want to bring that all in-house. Interventionists. Yeah, that's it. They found the gold standard as a serious obstacle for them to want to manipulate wages and prices, okay? These are people who want control. The gold standard, or your currency hedged against the gold standard, provides that confidence, okay? It doesn't allow, for people to come in and be able to, small parties, different groups that want to be able to create or exercise certain things in order to have a measure of control. Then you had what are called the credit expansionists, and this is basically a Keynes economics, that credit expansion is the panacea for all economic ills, which is, the theory of, okay, if we're in a recession, create a bunch of currency or do quantitative easing, which has been done, quite a lot in the last 10, 15 years, in order to get money into the marketplace, in order to get people spending money. Now, in theory, that may sound pretty good. And in practice, that has happened to some degree in short periods of time in different economies around the world. But there's all kinds of problems associated with that particular way of doing things. So what this did is once it had been severed, everybody went off the gold standard, and in modern day, our reserves are primarily U.S. currency, which again is a fiat currency. It allowed central banks to print money beyond their reserves. In a world of government money, They have not been able to decree its money roll away. Okay, and that's where I'm going to end there for this particular podcast. A lot of information, went a fair bit longer than what I wanted to. Okay, so hope everybody's well. Hit like, hit subscribe. Hope you've enjoyed the M.I.L.F podcast. Get outside, as I mentioned every week, do a little exercise, do your research on nutrition. Interesting Peter Attia podcast I was listening to yesterday. It's about a 2-hour. Can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's an epidemiologist. And, we've been hearing that word a lot lately. So for those that don't know what epidemiology is, it's basically the statistical study of health and disease. There's a lot of people that will say epidemiology has failed us pretty miserably in the 20th and 21st century. And I would tend to agree with that when you look at all of the nutrition mandates that have come out since primarily the 1950s, and the majority of them have been so fucking far out in left field and wrong, contributing to high levels of insulin resistance, hence obesity and things of that nature. But this particular podcast just dealt with obesity. I would encourage everybody to listen to it. The last Peter Attia podcast. Wish I had the name of the doctor for you, but I don't. And some of the stats that came out of this were pretty amazing. Now, I'll just bring one to your attention, then I'll end the podcast. A lot of people make the claim that when it comes to obesity and race, so we're talking white, Black people, Hispanics. I'm just going to use those three groups to keep it simple. That the obesity problem, which it is a problem, we're hitting 40% here in North America, Canada, US combined. Talked about BMI index at all, and why it's a general metric. It's not a metric that a doctor is going to use, to drill down to determine what course of action you need in order to lose weight. But getting back to the racial component of this, a lot of people think that because your socioeconomic situation is dismal, i.e. you're in a low income bracket and you live in a shitty neighborhood in an urban center, that those people have a tendency to be more obese than people of upper middle, upper class. Well, that's only true for one group. That's only true for white women. When you look at, and Black men, when you look at Black women, they have the same road. Okay, so the Black woman who's living on food stamps or low welfare income in an urban center in the US, that group has the same obesity index as a Black woman who is on Atlanta Housewives. That group, same obesity index. So it's not a socioeconomic thing for that demographic. The same thing with Hispanic people, both male and female. It has zero to do with their socioeconomic status. You hear that argument all the time, but the data shows that it doesn't. Black men and white women, it's true. Now, they haven't drilled down enough to determine the factors related. That's not causation. The study just produced data that was that made their eyes open and said, wow, this is fucking different. We never thought this would happen. They haven't found the causation for why that happens. They've just looked at the data and they've said, this group represents this group represents this, okay? But again, the reason I bring this up is you have to question the narrative. You have to question every fucking narrative that's going on out there. You have to, because I'm watching, Fox News bits and drabs here. I won't watch CNN because they're a fucking shit show. But, every once in a while I'll watch Fox News, and I'm looking at the coverage of Russia and Ukraine, and they're getting so many things wrong. And these are multi-million-dollar corporations, and I'll group CNN, MSNBC, CBC, CTV Global. They get so much wrong when they're narrating or reporting on TV. It baffles the imagination. 50 years ago, I didn't see this. I can turn on the TV for 1 minute, and it doesn't matter what news channel I'm watching, they are spreading dis or misinformation. They are. It's simple as that. All you have to do is go to the sources, Go to smart people, go to people that are on the inside, like this Michael Corman that I was talking about, and get the information right from the stores instead of having the information come into a newsroom, get editorialized, and scripted and sent the fuck out the other end so that you can have a look at it. Anyways, that's my slight rant for the day. Okay, so enjoy yourselves. Have a great day. We'll be coming at you soon next week with a different topic. We'll see you Friday with the cognitive bias ditty. Jim Lawrence, M.I.L.F. podcast, Me, I Like Facts, signing off. Have a great one. Bye-bye.